5 days ago, on July 11th, a housing law took effect that almost nobody is talking about. I've watched the coverage, and it's all mortgage rates and home builder stock prices. Nobody's explaining what this actually means if you're 55, 65, or 75 years old and trying to figure out where you're going to live for the next 20 years. Roughly 3 out of 4 adults over 50 say they'd rather stay in their current home as they age than move somewhere new. That's a well-documented preference, not a guess. And yet a huge share of that same group is stuck. Stuck because the house needs work they can't afford. Stuck because there's nothing smaller to move into. Stuck because rent keeps climbing faster than a Social Security check does. This law was built with exactly that problem in mind. Make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now, because every week I cover the real financial information that affects seniors directly. The rules that changed, the protections you already qualify for, and the steps that actually make a difference. This is exactly the kind of content I put out every single week, and you do not want to miss it. Now, let's get into it. Let's get the basics straight, because the backstory is more interesting than most people realize. The bill is H.R. 6644, officially the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. ROAD stands for Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream, which tells you it's a merger of a House bill and a Senate bill stitched into one. The Senate passed it 85-5 on June 21st. The House followed with 358-32 the next day. Those are landslide margins you almost never see in Congress anymore, on anything. What most coverage buried is this: President Trump never signed it. He'd scheduled a signing ceremony, then canceled it. His stated objection wasn't to the housing bill itself. He wanted Congress to pass a separate voter ID measure first, the Save America Act, and was using the housing bill as leverage to get it. Because Congress stayed in session and Trump neither signed nor vetoed within the constitutional 10-day window, the legislation became law automatically on July 11th, under Article 1 of the Constitution. So it's binding law now, regardless of the fact that no president ever put a pen to it. Why is Congress moving this fast on housing at all? The White House's Council of Economic Advisors estimated earlier this year that the country is short roughly 10 million homes. I'll be straight with you, that figure is genuinely disputed. Private research firms put the real gap closer to 1 million, depending on how you count missing households versus units that physically don't exist. But every serious estimate, from the White House's high end down to the more conservative private ones, agrees on the direction. There aren't enough homes at prices ordinary people can afford, and that's been driving up costs for buyers, renters, and anyone hoping to downsize. Seniors are caught squarely in that squeeze. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies has tracked cost burden, spending more than 30% of income on housing, climbing for years among older homeowners, alongside rising insurance premiums, property taxes, and utility bills. Nationally, roughly a quarter of homeowners and about half of renters currently qualify as cost-burdened. What's easy to miss is that this isn't only a mortgage problem. Plenty of these homeowners paid off their loans decades ago. It's the insurance, tax, and repair bills stacked on top of a paid-off house that push people into that 30% threshold. That's the backdrop for everything below. Point 1, help to stay put safely. Tucked into the law is the Whole Home Repairs Act, a 5-year pilot program at HUD. It funds state, local, and tribal programs that give homeowners, and in some cases landlords, grants and forgivable loans for repairs. Grab bars, ramps, wider doorways, weatherization, removal of mold or lead hazards, and structural fixes like roofing and electrical work before they turn into emergencies. One thing to clear up here: this isn't free money with no strings attached. Part of it is a straight grant. part of it is a forgivable loan, meaning the debt disappears if you meet the program's conditions, often staying in the home for a set period. Either way, it isn't something you're expected to repay out of pocket like a conventional loan. Income limits, eligible repair categories, and dollar amounts will be finalized state by state. As HUD stands to pilot up, so watch your local area agency on aging and your state housing finance agency for when applications open. Point 2, more places to downsize into. A large piece of this law loosens the rules that have made smaller, cheaper housing hard to build. Accessory dwelling units, duplexes, townhomes, and the conversion of vacant office buildings. Dead malls and shuttered factories into housing under a new pilot modeled on legislation known as the Reside Act. On top of that, there's a genuine shift for manufactured and modular homes. The permanent steel chassis requirement is gone. That sounds technical, but it matters. The chassis rule existed mainly to make homes towable, even though almost nobody relocates a manufactured home once it's placed. Housing researchers estimate scrapping it could shave $5,000 to $10,000 off the cost of a manufactured home. Paired with expanded financing support, that's a meaningful, if gradual, expansion of affordable options, especially in rural areas where manufactured housing already makes up a large share of the market. Point 3, renter protections with limits. The rental assistance demonstration cap goes up by 100,000 units, letting more public housing convert into a funding structure that draws in additional dollars while extending tenant protections along the way. Existing affordable rental units also get preservation support so they aren't lost to market rate conversion. The piece I'd flag most is a new renter outreach resource at HUD aimed specifically at tenants of large institutional landlords, meant to help people flag disputes and violations. To be candid, this isn't a courtroom. It comes with no new legal remedies attached, functioning as an outreach and complaint routing channel rather than an enforcement body with teeth of its own. Still, for someone whose landlord is a faceless investment fund instead of a person they can call, having any federal point of contact is new. It didn't exist before. One thing worth knowing if you rely on a voucher today: the law doesn't force landlords to accept them, so whether this expansion actually gets you into a unit still depends heavily on participation rates where you live. Separately, the law directs HUD to stand up a national eviction helpline, giving tenants facing an eviction filing somewhere to call for guidance on their rights and local resources before they end up in housing court without any idea what to do. Point 4, the Wall Street landlord rule, and this is where the details get oversimplified elsewhere. Any large institutional investor, legally defined as an entity controlling at least 350 single-family homes, alone or together with affiliated entities, is generally barred from buying additional existing single-family homes. That restriction kicks in 180 days after enactment, roughly early January 2027, and stays in place for 15 years unless Congress revisits it. Enforcement has actual bite: civil penalties up to $1 million per violation, or 3 times the purchase price, whichever is larger. That said, nothing forces these companies to sell homes they already hold. The restriction only governs future purchases. There are meaningful exceptions too. Investors can still build homes for sale. Build-to-rent developments are exempt. Renovate-to-rent programs qualify. And there's a carve-out for age-restricted communities for people 55 and older. An earlier Senate draft would have forced build-to-rent investors to resell those homes to individual buyers after 7 years. That mandatory resale requirement got stripped out before final passage, a notable softening from what was originally proposed. That change wasn't incidental. Reporting at the time indicated the 7-year mandate was close to becoming a deal breaker for the White House, and removing it was part of what got the administration to formally back the final bill. Economists disagree on how much difference this will make. Analysts at Beaufort Global Research put institutional investors owning 1,000 plus homes at well under 1% of the national housing stock. Though in specific metros, like parts of Jacksonville, Florida, such investors own a much larger slice of single-family rentals, above 20% by some counts, and cities like Dallas and Phoenix have seen investor-owned homes roughly double or triple over the past several years. So expect a modest national effect concentrated in the handful of markets where these buyers cluster. Critics on both sides have also noted a group of investors could split into several smaller entities to stay under the 350 home line, a workaround Congress is aware of and may target later. Point 5. Small dollar mortgages. An FHA pilot expands access to mortgages under $100,000 with assistance toward down payments, closing costs, appraisals, and title insurance. Lenders have historically avoided originating loans this small because the profit margin doesn't justify the paperwork. This is aimed squarely at buyers of modest, lower-priced homes. Plenty of seniors looking at smaller markets, along with first-time buyers who don't need a jumbo loan. Point 6. Cutting the red tape that slows construction. HUD must now publish guidance to help states and cities modernize zoning codes that currently ban anything but large single-family homes on most residential lots. The kind of rules that make it illegal to build a duplex or a small apartment building, even on a lot zoned for housing. Environmental review requirements under the National Environmental Policy Act also get streamlined for infill development and federally supported housing, which can shave real years off projects that used to sit in permitting limbo. Buried alongside that is a more technical fix building cost researchers have been pushing for years. Federal guidelines now support what's called point access block construction, meaning apartment buildings with a single central staircase instead of the 2 stairwells that most U.S. building codes have required since the mid-20th century. That single change lets developers fit more and more varied unit layouts onto the same footprint, which several countries with cheaper housing costs already allow. None of this puts a new house on the market next month, but it lowers the cost and speed barriers behind why so little has been built at prices people can actually afford. A few more pieces worth a mention, even though they didn't make my top 6. The law authorizes a $200 million a year competitive grant fund for 5 years to help communities pay for the water, sewer, and road infrastructure that new housing developments depend on. Infrastructure gaps are one of the quieter reasons local governments reject projects that would otherwise pencil out. It also funds a program to help HUD create pre-approved housing blueprints, sometimes called pattern books, so smaller builders in towns don't have to pay an architect from scratch every time they want to put up a starter home. It raises the cap on how much banks can invest in public welfare projects like affordable housing from 15% of capital to 20%, giving community banks more room to finance these developments locally. And for veterans specifically, the law excludes VA disability benefits from being counted as income when determining eligibility for VA supportive housing vouchers. A narrow fix, but one that had been quietly disqualifying disabled veterans from housing assistance they otherwise qualified for. There's also a lower profile change to how HUD oversees housing counseling agencies, the nonprofits that help people navigate mortgage applications or work through delinquency. The law gives HUD more authority to review their performance and require additional training, aimed at raising the quality of advice people get before they sign anything. On the lending side, the law reforms appraiser licensing and training standards and requires lenders to have a clear process for homebuyers to request a second appraisal when they think the first one came in wrong. A real issue for older homeowners in markets where local comps are thin and one bad appraisal can sink a sale or refinance. And for families already in public housing or receiving rental assistance, a new opt-out pilot lets them build an escrow savings account of up to $5,000 through HUD's existing family self-sufficiency program. Money they can put toward a move, a repair, or eventually a down payment. Zoom out, and the real story here isn't any single provision. It's the mismatch between the bill's size and how it actually reaches people. Legislative researchers have called this the most significant federal housing measure since 1990, but almost nothing in it is self-executing. Every program above rolls out state by state, agency by agency, over the next several years, and nearly all of it requires someone to apply rather than simply receive it. A repair grant nobody applies for helps nobody. A small dollar mortgage pilot doesn't matter if lenders in your area haven't opted in yet. That's the actual risk with a bill like this. Not that it's hollow, but that it's easy to miss. And the agencies rolling it out have little budget of their own for public outreach. So word of mouth is doing a lot of the work that a marketing campaign normally would.